We do these authors' nights at Accuracy in Academia for all you Capitol Hill interns, not just because we know you need to be fed, but because we know the kind of speakers and the narrow range of speakers and subjects you get on your campuses. And that's where tonight's subject, communism at home, comes in. They don't really want to talk about that at all. They don't want to talk about how we may have enabled the governments that are with us still, with some of them with missiles pointed right at us. As my favorite was the historian who said, "Why look at that? That was so long ago." Which I thought was an odd way for a historian to look at their chosen field. But that's me. Anyway, we have a terrific speaker to address this topic. He has done the primary research many academics don't, and which we kind of hold up as the standard at Accuracy in Media and Accuracy in Academia. If we did give you one piece of advice, and that's always dangerous, but it'd be get the best information you can, as much of it as you can. And that's why we do these authors' nights, which are made possible by a generous grant from the Frank A. and Nellie Goletti Fusco Foundation, for which we are most grateful. Our speaker tonight has written a lot of books. He's written a lot, period. But the latest one is one that sent him through many archives, Stalin's Secret Agents. And he is not only a friend of Accuracy in Media and Accuracy in Academia, he's a friend of a lot of us personally, a mentor to a lot of us. He's been ahead of the curve for a very long time and continues to be. Ladies and gentlemen, M. Stanton Evans.
Thank you, Malcolm, and thank all of you for being here. Really nice to meet you, and I want to find out a little bit more about you in a moment. I'm always encouraged when I meet young people like yourselves and that you're doing what you're doing, and that you're here tonight and doing, I'm sure, many other things that are similar, parallel. It indicates that there are people in the world who can see beyond keeping up with the Kardashians or Storage Wars, which is one of my favorites, by the way. I don't know if you caught that. Very gripping when they open those lockers. But anyway, it's good to know there are young people that are interested in serious matters and encouraging to me. And I've been out here a long time, and to see you folks coming along it makes me very optimistic about the future. I am not a historian, really. I'm a journalist by profession and practice and training background, have been for over 50 years. I am a conservative journalist, which is, as they say, an oxymoron. An oxymoron is a phrase that is self-contradictory, like jumbo shrimp or rap music, or one of my favorites, Senate Ethics Committee. So I go against the grain, and in fact, John Berlau here was at a talk I gave on Monday of last week, so you heard this then. But it's true. I'm a contrarian. I don't just go with the crowd. For example, the instance I cited then was that the only time I text is when I am driving. It helps to pass the time, and makes me a bit different. And I sort of bring that perspective to these books and these issues to which Mal has referred. The most important part of this would be, I think, the Q&A. I cannot possibly give you a complete synopsis of this book, but I hope to raise some points that are of some interest to you, might connect up with something that you have heard or learned in school or seen in the media or wherever. And I would like to get your reactions to what I say and to get your perspective a little bit. Now, let me ask you, coming back to you more specifically, all you folks, are all of you Hill interns? Do you all work in anybody not in a congressional office? You're all congressional? Where are you, sir?
I'm at the Washington Examiner through the National Journal.
With the Examiner?
Through the National Journalism Center.
Through the NJC? Well, good for you. There you go. That's where Mel and I were, and John Burlow is a graduate of the NJC. Excellent. Who else? Hold your hand up, please. Go down the line. You, sir.
Yeah, I'm at a nonprofit called Pro-English. We try to make English the official language of the U.S.
Very good. I think that could start with the native-born population. A good thing to do. Young lady. You're here. You didn't have far to come to. Anybody else down the line? Go ahead. All heritage. Okay, okay. Anybody else? Yes, over here.
Department of Justice.
Where?
The Department of Justice.
At DOJ?
Yeah.
How'd you get in there? I don't. You don't have to tell me. I was sort of taken aback there. Does Eric Holder know you're here?
We're being listened to.
Well, that follows anyway, right? In fact, I got a call a little while ago. It was the NSA saying, "Could I speak a little bit louder?" They weren't able to tape everything I was saying. Who else have we got who is not on the Hill?
Us for FreedomWorks.
FreedomWorks.
Be on a DOJ watch list.
Oh, yeah. Well, did you hear the Jay Leno joke about Tim Tebow? Everybody here know who Tim Tebow is? Maybe the young ladies don't. He is a somewhat controversial quarterback in the National Football League, and he's very controversial because he's a Christian. And he is also said to be not such a great quarterback, although he won a bunch of games at Denver when he was there. And he got traded. He was at the Jets last year. He did nothing and didn't get in a game, I don't think, last year. But he got traded to the Patriots, the New England Patriots, Tom Brady, that team. And so Leno told us, like he said, that it was good news for Tim Tebow that he's now, back in NFL football. But the bad news is that now that he's got Patriot in his title, he's being audited by the IRS. Pretty good joke by Jay Leno. And I heard him say today on the tape, I don't know if he said it today, but I heard on tape today that Obama has very good insurance against impeachment. And that insurance is called Joe Biden. Which is very true. Okay, did I connect up with everybody who is? Yes, ma'am.
I'm an actress in media.
You are? Okay, well, good. Good for you. I'm a great fan of AIM. I knew Reed Irvine back in the day. Great man. And, of course, Don, Debbie, Mal, all the folks there I've known for a long time. It's a great organization. Okay, well, anyway, it's good to know a little bit more about to whom I'm speaking. And I do commend you all for what you're doing and where you're doing it, and for being here tonight. The book that you now have in your possession is a follow-up to a book I wrote 7 years ago, or brought out 7 years ago. It took me many years to write it, which is a book about a man named Senator Joe McCarthy. I don't know how many of you ever heard of Joe McCarthy, McCarthyism, and so forth. And this is a long-standing phrase in our politics and in our histories about the Cold War, the Red Scare of the 50s in the United States, and so on. And I am of an age to remember that era. I was in college when that was going on. And so I've always had an interest in it. I wrote this book about McCarthy and his cases and the whole controversy about communists in the government. And the issue there was, were there communists in the government? And I was able to get access, Mal's references to this, to the FBI files about this era. Now, back then, the files were not available but they became available under Freedom of Information, which is a great tool for finding stuff out, 50 years after the fact. And using that instrument, I was able to get about 100,000 pages of FBI files, which I now have in my possession. And Malcolm helped me do some of this back in the day. And if you go through those files, you can now find the data that relate to these cases, these charges, these allegations, these denials, and so forth from the 1950s. So I wrote a 600-page book about McCarthy, which was devoted to the question, were there communists in the government? To which I took 600 pages to say, duh, yeah, there were. There were tons of them. They were all over the place. And we can now see this in the records that are available, not only from the FBI, but from behind the Iron Curtain, from the other records of the Cold War that are now, some of them are available, not all of them, but many are. And that's what that book was about, was the question of whether they were there, and the answer was they were there. So then the question becomes, so what? What about it? What of it? This book that you have now, which is a much shorter book, is the So What book. It's about what they did, or at least part of what they did. To go into everything they did would be almost impossible in any single book. And what we did, I had a co-author, Herbert Romer, who's now unfortunately deceased, who was a real expert in these matters. He worked for the House Intelligence Committee, the House Internal Security Committee, the House Committee on Un-American Activities. He worked for the U.S. Information Agency, working on Soviet issues. He was a real expert. I am not. I'm a journalist. And we combined information. I had this FBI stuff and some other things. He had all this stuff. He had gone to the Soviet Union, or Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and East Germany and Poland and elsewhere, and collected a lot of documents. And in drafting this book, I had to do the drafting because he became ill, but the drafting depended a lot on the documents that he came up with. And these documents reflect a lot of the same things that our documents do. So you put them together, you get a composite of the data of what was going on, and you're able to trace things through different avenues of discussion that are portrayed in a certain way in the history books that when you look behind the scenes are very different. And something, I mean, to you guys, this is World War, actually, I think I used this also, John, last week, that there is a lack of historical knowledge in our country that I think we're all aware of. And we have a good friend named Pat Korten, who was on the board of the Journalism Center back in the day. And he was the morning news anchor here on WTOP for many years. And he told a story in 1994, which is the 50th anniversary of D-Day, which was the landing of the Americans at Normandy in France to start the liberation of Europe from the Nazis. And there were all these ceremonies and commemorations of the 50th anniversary of that event. And he was somewhere in the Midwest, I forget where, and watching a TV show, and a young lady was reading from the teleprompter about these events, and she referred to World War XI. And I said, Pat, is this a true story? It's like something you made it up. No, he swears it was true. And that suggests a number of things. One, we're not teaching history in the schools very well, since there have not yet been 11 world wars, only 2. And it also suggests we're not teaching Latin, although you'd think after all these Super Bowls, mentioning Tim Tebow, that we know something about Roman numerals. But no. So there's a real problem here of lack of knowledge, to put it mildly. And also, this stuff for people of your generation is like, it might as well be, the War of 1812 or something. This is so far in the past, so long before you were even born, that you might wonder, why do you need to know this stuff? Well, part of it is you need to know history. We need to know what really happened as opposed to some fake narrative, which is unfortunately what's out there. But also because there are parallels to what's happening now in many ways, and things that will affect you in the present and the future. And I'm going to come back to those in the third hour of my remarks. Just kidding. It's a very nervous silence there. So what did he say? So there are things that are happening now that really are eerily similar to what happened during the Cold War. For example, one of the reasons these communists got into the government in World War XI, or World War II, as I call it, was that the Russians were our allies against the Nazis. And so there was this mindset of they're good people, and they're our noble ally. And therefore, we could not bar communists from getting into our government. And there were actually rules passed down. There's a chapter devoted to this in this book about what some of these rules were. And they basically said, well, we can't discriminate against communists here because the Russians are our allies. So it was sort of like you got to let these communists into the government, and they went beyond that. Almost, I phrase it in some discussions as almost an affirmative action program for communists. But someone was looking at the government saying, the problem with this government is there are not enough communists here. We need more communists. So go out and get them, and they did. So they had hundreds of them in the government. And the other point that needs correction, not only that they were there, it's what they did when they were there. And this is, again, a mindset that has its parallels today. They were treated as if they were just sort of, they were just like anybody else. They were just mere members of the Communist Party. What's the problem with that? And that mindset is current today also with some other folks that mean us harm. The result of this was that we had a lot of people in our government in that era who were, in fact, agents of the Soviet Union. That's what that boiled down to. These people were not just people who disagreed on philosophy or something. They were agents of a hostile foreign power in the post-war era who worked to advance the interests of the Soviet Union against free world interests. And that went on for a long time until they cleared them out of the government in the latter 50s, mid to late 50s. Some of them still hung on. And the mindset hung on long after that until we had Reagan. And Reagan had a very different view of all this, President Reagan, because he knew communists from his experience in Hollywood. They had been his antagonists in the Screen Actors Guild. And he had no illusions about what they were and what they were about. And he therefore got underway a set of policies to undermine them instead of letting them undermine us. And that changed everything, and the Iron Curtain fell, and everything that's happened since the latter 80s in Eastern Europe. Well, that is all after the fact of what this book is about. This book is about what happened during the war and the post-war conferences that occurred between President Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, who was the dictator of the Soviet Union, and Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England. They had two conferences, or three of them, and those conferences are the central events in this book. And what I found out, and Herb found out in different venues, was that in many of these conferences, the people calling the shots on our side were agents of the other side, agents of the Soviet Union. And a good example, or a bad example, was the Yalta Conference. And you probably, in your history classes, you may have heard about this or read about it. This occurred in February 1945. What I discovered, and the book goes into this in some detail, by the time of that conference, which was the final major conference of the war among the three big powers, Roosevelt was virtually, our president, was virtually dead. He died 2 months later. it's very questionable to me how much he understood of what was going on at that conference and how much he consciously did or other people did in his name. And the book addresses that to the degree we can. We don't know a lot, but what we do know, I tried to address. The Secretary of State at that time was a man named Edward R. Stettinius, Jr., who had been Secretary of State for 2 months before that conference. So neither Roosevelt nor Stettinius was really on top of his game, to put it mildly. And Stettinius was very, very unsure about many, many issues, as you can imagine, having been there for 2 months, although he'd been in the State Department for a year before. There was one person at the conference who very much knew exactly what he was doing, and I try to document this in the book. His name was Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was a Soviet agent in our State Department. And as far as I can tell, looking at the records and getting some records that aren't in the official compilations, he probably was the most influential single American at Yalta, where his nominal boss, Roosevelt, was meeting with his real boss, Stalin. And Hiss is behind the scenes doing all kinds of things, and I was able to track a number of them. And this goes to the question what Mal mentioned about doing research in primary sources. This is getting into the weeds, but the weeds is where the snakes are, so you have to go there. And the weeds here involve the records of what happened at Yalta. Where are these records? The State Department, 10 years after that event, 1955, the event is at 45, published a thick book, a 1,000-page book, about the Yalta Conference. I have this book. They did the same thing on Tehran and many other conferences. They took forever to put these books out. But anyway, there are 1,000 pages there of records of what happened at Yalta. The papers of Edward R. Stettinius, Jr., Secretary of State, are not included in that compilation. The reason was they didn't have them. The State Department did not have the papers. When Stettinius left the State Department in 1945, went to the UN and did some other things, he took his papers with him. And since they didn't compile the papers until 1955, he was long gone. He died in 1949. They didn't have the papers. They didn't know where they were. So in my mind, the question was, where are these papers? And if one looks long enough, any aspiring journalists here, you must be if you're at the NJC, you can find stuff, but you got to be willing to spend a lot of time looking for it. Those papers are at the University of Virginia, Charlottesville. And the reason for that was that Stettinius was connected to UVA, and after he died a relatively young man, he died in 1949, his family had these papers, and they probably didn't know what they were, and they wound up in an attic someplace. And box after box after box of his papers were just stashed away somewhere. And by the 1970s, somewhere along in there, I don't know exactly when, they made their way back to UVA, where he was connected, and they wound up in Charlottesville. And there they sit. Now, in 1975, there was a highly condensed version of these papers published commercially, which I have, but it's very partial. So I went to Charlottesville and went through these papers. And there's a ton of stuff there. And what those, can I have a copy of the book? Can I borrow that? See, I really came very well prepared since I don't have a copy of my own book. Well, I didn't expect to read from it, but if you all have it, this is very convenient that you have it. If you turn to chapter 3, entitled See Alger Hiss About This, what you'll find there is that Stettinius, and again, we are deep into the weeds here. Join me here in the weeds. Stettinius is writing a memoir of this world-changing conference. This is the conference that handed half the globe to Moscow. Roosevelt just signed over country after country to Stalin. And so a man named Walter Johnson, who was a historian at I think the University of Chicago. It became rather famous later. And now there's another Walter Johnson. There was a picture for the Washington Senators, but this was not he. This is a different person. And Walter Johnson is questioning Stettinius about what happened at Yalta. And he's asking Stettinius all these questions about, well, who did this, who decided that, who wrote this, what happened then, and so forth. And Stettinius doesn't know, even though he's Secretary of State. So if you look at page 45, you've got that right there. A sequence of questions in which Johnson is trying to find out what happened so he can ghostwrite this book or help write this book for Stettinius. And it says in the third paragraph on the subject of assigning, see that? There's a whole sequence of questions there, which you can read for yourself. I won't read them to you, in which time and time and time again, Stettinius says to the historian, well, you better talk to Alger Hiss about that. Alger Hiss will know the answer to that. See Alger Hiss about that, and so forth. And this is not all. I just took about 8 or 9 quotes. These notes are in those archives at UVA. That's where they are. But you have to go there to get them because they're not available. They're not on the Internet. And let me say something about the Internet, because everybody knows that I'm a complete Luddite, which is a person that does not like technology. I don't like any new technology whatsoever. I use nothing but old technologies. So I'm prejudiced against new technologies. Be that as it may, there are certain uses to the Internet. But there are certain problems with the Internet. And I know all of you know more about it than I do and use it a lot more than I possibly could. But one of the things that's wrong with it is anybody can put anything up there. Have you ever Googled yourself? I know when I'm being Googled because it tickles. You can always tell when that is occurring. And if you Google yourself, you'll see all kinds of stuff maybe that is not true. Anybody can put anything up there about you, and it's just there. And that's true of all, and then get on to issue controversies, all kinds of things are up there, colliding with each other, and how do you choose? The other downside is a lot of stuff you need to know is not up there. And I guarantee you the stuff I'm talking about here is not on the Internet. It ain't there. It can't be, because it might be now if somebody takes it out of my book. But it's not there otherwise. And that's why you cannot depend on secondary sources. You can use them to backtrack and find out things, but you cannot stop there. You've got to go beyond that to find the original source. So that's the lesson I think Mal is talking about, which is true for journalists on anything you do, and indeed for scholars. One of the great problems in the histories we have and in the narratives of the war is that people are just recycling the same stuff from one book to another. It's the same thing said over and over again, and much of what is said is not true. There are other things in the book like that, but I throw that at you for what it's worth. The net result of the people like Hiss being in the government was that they were able to influence our policy, and this is a crucial point of this book. It isn't just about spying. We have a spy museum here in Washington, which is fine. I'm all for that. But spying was not the real problem. The problem was the policy influence. Their ability of these agents to deflect our policy in favor of Moscow. So that you really had a situation, I'm sure you've all seen some of these Bourne Identity movies, these Matt Damon movies, and so movies of that type. And there's always this conspiracy of these really bad guys who are trying to take over the world. And so Matt Damon must stop them. And that's the guy. We should have had Matt Damon back then. It would have been much better if we'd had Damon running around in 1945, but he wasn't born yet. Couldn't happen. And so that's fiction. It's made up. But that really happened. All that stuff happened, except not like that. I mean, real bad guys were making a real effort to take over the whole world. And the people standing in their way were Americans, the United States of America. So the crucial thing for them was to infiltrate our government and to corrupt our policy in favor of the Soviet Union. And that happened at Yalta. It happened many other episodes that I won't bore you with now. Now let me wrap up here and yield to your questions. But I want to jump forward to the present and the statement I made earlier about parallels in the mindset of, well, they're just members of the Communist Party. What is the problem here? I mean, they're just members of a party. If you look at what has happened in America in the last decade or from before that, you'll see the same kind of mindset applied to radical Islam, to terrorism. And again, you guys are pretty young to remember this, but the original 9/11 was in 2001, 12 years ago. And at the time there, Malcolm, I think you did some of this, or maybe it was Mark. We went and looked at all facets of the security set up in America, which was like a sieve. These people were just coming in here willy-nilly, doing anything they wanted to, and nobody was paying much attention to them. And of the 19 terrorists who did the bombings of the original 9/11, 15 came from Saudi Arabia. They had visas to come here from Saudi Arabia, and they got over here and they hijacked these planes and ran around and did all kinds of bad stuff, killed thousands of people. And we took a look, and I've got the language here, at the visa application form that somebody had to fill out in 2001, and this stayed up for a decade. Again, I read this last week, John, when you were there. I hope I'm not boring you by repeating these matters. And this was the visa application form you had to fill out in the State Department website to get a visa to come to the United States. And I'm not making this up. The questions were these. Do you seek to enter the United States to engage in export control violations, subversive or terrorist activities, or any other unlawful purpose? They're asking you this question, see? Next, are you a member or representative of a terrorist organization? Have you ever participated in persecutions directed by the Nazi government of Germany? How old are these people? I mean, 70-year-old acts of state in Germany? Or have you ever participated in genocide? I mean, wiping out whole races of people. So I'm in Saudi Arabia filling out this form. Look at that. Oh, yeah, let's see. Yeah, maybe some export control with violations would be good. Maybe some subversion. And I am a member of Al-Qaeda. Yep, yes. And, yeah, I did some of that Nazi stuff. I was just a kid, I was confused. And some genocide, but that went with the Nazi part, So I go, and is it you buy? Yes, no, yes, no. So yes, 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 yes. So I check yes to all these questions, as if anybody would. And then it says, while a yes answer, I can't read this without cracking up. While a yes answer does not automatically signify ineligibility, I'm not making it up. If you answered yes, you may be required to personally appear before a consular officer. So I'm a Nazi, and I'm in Al-Qaeda, and I commit genocide, and I'd like to do some terrorism. Well, then we need to talk, because we need to find out really more about you. I mean, hello. So, first of all, nobody's going to say all of that, but even if they did, you say, well, it doesn't necessarily disqualify. Well, that's the same mindset. And I remember 3 years ago, I was up in New York doing a TV show, and just a few days before, there was a deal where a guy from Pakistan had driven a car bomb into Times Square. I don't know if you all were tracking stuff at that date in your lives, but this guy's from Pakistan. He drives a car bomb in the middle of Times Square and tries to blow it up, and he is spotted by an alert hot dog vendor proving that our Homeland Security system is working because the hot dog vendors are first line of defense, and we know that, particularly in New York where they have a lot of them. And so the hot dog vendor turns and then he's running to Kennedy Airport and he tries to get a jet to Dubai to then go back to Pakistan. So they catch him at the airport. He doesn't get away, and I guess he's in custody somewhere even now. And about the time I was there, Katie Couric, everybody know who Katie Couric is or was? I'm not sure what she's doing right now. But at that time, she was at CBS, and she was interviewing Mayor Bloomberg of New York. Anybody here from New York? Any of you from New York? Well, maybe even if you're not from New York, you may know the answer to this question. I asked it Monday night. Is Mayor Bloomberg a real person? I mean, he's like a figure out of a Tom Wolfe novel, like a strange person, strange character. But anyway, he's being interviewed by Katie Couric. So here are these two giant intellects, really. And she asked him, Mayor Bloomberg, what do you think why did this Pakistani man drive this car bomb into the middle of Times Square and try to blow up Times Square? What's going on here? And Mayor Bloomberg says, probably somebody upset about the health care bill.
That's right.
He did say that. Did they have some kind of health care problem in Pakistan? Is that what he's... I mean, hello. And I'll end it. I got to tell this. I didn't do this. This is for your benefit, John, because I did not tell this story Monday. I'll tell it. Has anybody ever seen the movie The Batman Returns? Did you ever see that? About 12 years ago, whenever it was. You've seen it?
Who was Batman in that?
Michael Keaton was Batman.
So, yes.
I mean, what kind of casting is that? But Penguin was Danny DeVito, I think.
Yeah. Christopher Walken for some reason.
Yeah, and Christopher Walken, he was Max Schreck, the department. Walken, and Michelle Pfeiffer was Catwoman. And I didn't understand Michael Keaton as Batman, personally. I mean, that's just me. It didn't seem like good casting, but so be it. So anyway, in the movie, of course, it's a big mystery. You all know Batman, right? And anybody who does not know the story of Batman? Cannot be. There's nobody that cannot know this story. Batman is actually billionaire playboy Bruce Wayne. You know that, right? We all know this. But no one in Gotham City knows this. It's totally unknown in Gotham City that Batman is, in fact, billionaire playboy Bruce Wayne, and Robin is his ward, Dick Grayson. Remember that? And although he doesn't figure in this. So anyway, there's a big mystery in Gotham City as to who Batman really is. And toward the end of the movie, there is a fight between Michelle Pfeiffer and Michael Keaton, Catwoman versus Batman. And Christopher Walken, who, by the way, is the greatest actor of this generation, or perhaps any other, and he's watching this fight, and he's all scared by it. And in the middle of this fight, Michelle Pfeiffer pulls the mask off of Batman's face, revealing that he is, in fact, Bruce Wayne, solving the mystery of who Batman is. To which Christopher Walken, as Max Schreck says, Bruce Wayne, why are you dressed up like Batman? And Michelle Pfeiffer says, because he is Batman, you moron. And that mindset is not unlike Mayor. Why is this Pakistani guy? Why are you driving a car? Well, you're some kind of Muslim. Why are you doing this? And that's the mindset we are dealing with. We dealt with it in World War XI, and we're dealing with it now, and we have dealt with it because it's like, final example, and no problem with Eric Holder here, but this does involve General Holder. General Holder was testifying before the House Judiciary Committee about this same episode. Lamar Smith, who was then the chairman, and Ted Poe, both from Texas, were questioning General Holder about this episode. And they asked General Holder what you think motivated this Pakistani guy to drive this car bomb into Times Square? And Holder says, well, there are many, many factors that go into, you never know what factors exactly motivate people. Could be any number of factors. And Ted Poe says, could one of those factors be radical Islam? And Holder said, what? What? He cannot say the words radical Islam. I'm sure it's policy in the administration. You cannot say those words. It cannot be said. So it's like this blinders on as to what we're facing today, just as happened during the war back 50 years ago. So there's a lesson there for your generation that isn't just of historical, antiquarian interest. Malcolm, that said, I yield the floor. I would say this to you. Please do use the microphone for your questions or comments. The more the merrier. I've said this before, say it again. When you get old, there are two bad things that happen to you. One is your hearing starts to go. And I forget what the other one is, but I'll probably think of it in a minute. So fire away. It's your turn.
Go ahead, John. We'll start.
Do I need a mic? Or?
Well, I can hear you pretty well.
You're pretty
yeah,
loud.
you're
Maybe
pretty
we'll
good.
let you do it by yourself.
Okay. I want to go back somewhat before y'all for something that's covered by this book. It was also covered by the late Herb Romer. I had interviewed him about it. You had mentioned conspiracy theories. There are conspiracy theories about, and some more documented than others, about Pearl Harbor,
Yep.
whether Roosevelt egged on the Japanese to attack, and how much he and the administration knew. I had always given those short shrift because at the end of the day, Japan still did the horrific deed and nobody forced them to. But what you and Mr. Roberstein have discovered, and others, was that Harry Dexter White, who was also probably probably the most powerful communist in the Roosevelt administration, may have egged on a Japanese attack, doing the Soviets' bidding because the Soviets didn't want to be in a two-front war. He may have, maneuvered it so that they would attack the U.S. instead of the Soviet Union. What is the evidence there?
The evidence there is quite strong. And it isn't just one guy. It was a whole bunch of people. There's a chapter called Remember Pearl Harbor. Now, for you young people, Pearl Harbor was the event that precipitated our involvement in the war against Japan and also, therefore, against the Nazis who were allied with Japan, December 7th, 1941. What had happened in the run-up to that period was that there were all kinds of conflicts within our government and also within the government of Japan as to what to do about all the turmoil occurring in the world at that time. The Russians had been in alliance with Hitler. There was a so-called Hitler-Stalin pact. For 2 years, or 22 months, not quite 2 years, they had been allies with Hitler. But in June of 1941, Hitler broke his agreement with Stalin and invaded Russia and sent the Soviet armies reeling backwards, and they were in great distress because of that. They were not prepared for it, and they were suffering greatly from that attack. If you look at the map, Germany is on the western side of Russia. Japan is on the eastern side. They boxed in Russia on its borders. Japan and Russia had a long history of hostility. And Stalin was deathly afraid that while Hitler was fighting him in the west, Japan would attack him from the east. The Japanese were allied with Hitler. And this was a great fear of his. He did not want this two-front war to which John has referred. This became a huge issue for Soviet agents around the world. One of them was in Tokyo. Not here, there was one here, but it starts in Tokyo. A man named Richard Sorge, S-O-R-G-E, who is probably the most effective Soviet agent in modern history. And he ran a ring of communists, first in China and then in Japan, which was very much involved in this discussion of what policy should be between Japan and Russia, Japan and Western powers. And Sorga and his Confederates, he had two Japanese communists who worked for him, one named Kinkazu Saionji and one named Hotsumi Ozaki. They're both in the book. And they were communists, and they had access to the Japanese cabinet. And they argued in that cabinet, as Sorga did undercover as a German journalist, supposedly, that there was no percentage for Japan in attacking Russia. Japan needed oil, and the oil was south. The oil was in the Dutch East Indies. And they didn't have any oil. We'd cut off oil. The export of oil from America had been cut off to them in the summer of 41, largely at the instigation of Harry Dexter White. So the argument of the Soviet agents in Tokyo was, we do not need to be fighting with Russia. We need to go against the Western powers. Here in Washington, Harry Dexter White, who was a top Soviet agent, I think more important than his, I think more so, looking at the total record. He's all over this book. Harry Dexter White headed a ring of communists in the Treasury Department, and there were at least a dozen of them in that one department. And his goal was to do the same thing as Sorga was doing in Tokyo, which was to make sure that there was no peace between the United States and Japan. And he was dealing with a KGB. KGB was the Soviet Secret Agent Corps, which stands for State Security Service, the Russian initials. And a man named Vitaly Pavlov was the KGB agent who came here to Washington, right down across from the Treasury Department on 15th Street, and met with White and told him the talking points he needed to make sure that there would be no truce between the United States and Japan. And he gave them these talking points to use and to get to the State Department, which he did, saying that we will not have any truce with Japan because we must stand up for China, where Japan was fighting. So you have a Soviet agent in Tokyo, and you have a Soviet agent in Washington, and more than one in both places, converging toward the same thing, which is that there will be no attack on Russia. There will be a fight between the United States and Japan. At the same time, there was a man in Chongqing, China, which was the capital, inland capital of China at that time, a man named Owen Lattimore, who was a very high-ranking person, a very good friend of another Soviet agent named Lachlan Curry, who was in the White House, who was also working the same angle. And Lachlan Curry got Owen Lattimore assigned to China as the advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, the head of China. And at the crucial juncture in this dispute, Lattimore sends a cable to Curry in the White House saying, there better not be any truce between the United States and Japan because Chiang Kai-shek will be very, very upset. So if you look at the total picture, they had the whole thing covered. They had Sorga in Tokyo, they had White and company and Curry here in Washington, and they had Lattimore in Chongqing. And so every facet of it was coordinated with every other one. The result of this was that on November 26, 1941, the day after the Lattimore cable came to Curry, who then got it to the State Department, Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State, presents a statement to the Japanese envoys, and I'm not excusing them for anything they did, but just telling you what happened, saying they got to get out of China or that's it. Well, they were not going to do that, and Hull knew they wouldn't. And so the Army Review Board looked at that, said that was the trigger that set off World War II. The Japanese, once they got that, said, well, that's it. It's a go, and we're going to attack Pearl Harbor, and they did. So that's what is in that chapter. All of that, everything I just told you and more is in that chapter, documented from KGB archives, from our own records, from FBI. And that doesn't go to what Roosevelt did or thought. It doesn't have anything to do with Roosevelt. I do not know. I've read lots of books about the Roosevelt policy leading up to that. And we do not even touch that in this book. The only thing I looked at, Herb and I looked at, was where we knew we had Soviet agents involved. If there were no Soviet agents involved, then whatever happened might have been terrible, but we did not address it. So.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Scott Alfred, and I go to Grove City College where I'm
Grove
a
City.
history major.
Do you
And-
know Paul Kingor?
Yes.
Good friend, good guy.
So my question is regarding the aspects of history, and you talked about how secondary sources are not nearly as important as going to the primary sources. How do you think we can address the problems of how history is taught now? Do you think primary sources is one of the best solutions? And how do you think that, along with that, do you think that good history in many ways parallels good journalism?
Yes, that's a very good question, a very accurate summary. I think it's the same thing. But let me go to the question of the secondary sources versus primary sources. The great problem is that it's hard to get past the secondary sources. Not that they're not important, they are hugely important. But that's all most people have. The average person cannot go spend hours in the National Archives. It just can't be done. Or at the FBI. So only a few people can do that kind of thing. And that makes it very difficult to navigate these books. Most of the books, it's hard for me to generalize because there are thousands of books and I haven't read them all. But most of the books I've read, and I've read quite a few, that purport to be histories of Yalta or World War II or subversion of the government or any of these issues are just wrong. They're wrong. And one of the great difficulties is they are recycling stuff that they have not themselves researched. Look in the footnotes in most books, and you'll see very few references to primary documents. You might find some. But if they are, they're often very narrow. There are certain niches that people look at. For example, the question of Harry Dexter White. There are books now, there's some pretty good books about White available now. One of them is quite good. It's called The Battle of Bretton Woods, which was a conference in the summer of 1944 that set up the International Monetary Fund. And I was with the author of that book here, right in the Lerman Auditorium, back a couple of months ago. It's a good book. But he used primary sources. He went to the sources and not somebody else's book. It's just hard to do that. What I try to do, is if I find a secondary source, and if I have a question about it, I try to go from there to the primary source. But I can't always even do that. I mean, a lot of it has to do with how much confidence you place in the secondary source. For example, Herb Romer, my co-author, wrote several books, one called The Venona Secrets. Venona was a book, was a code name. The book is about a code project in which the American, the predecessor to the NSA, to the people that are now listening to this discussion, and I'm sure are fascinated by it. It was called the American, I think it was called the Army Security Agency back then. And someone intercepted a lot of the cables from Moscow to their intelligence agents here, and they set to work. They were all encrypted. They were in code. And they broke the code and were able to find out the meaning of about 3,000 of these cables. These are called the Venona papers, which is just a made-up code name. Herb wrote a book about those papers and what they showed. I knew Herb Romer. I knew how he worked. I have confidence in Herb Romer. If Herb Romer wrote it, I believe it. And I also have those papers, so I don't need to rely on them alone. But that's an example of somebody who writes a book that you can count on. And there are others. John Earl Haynes at the Library of Congress, or was there, he's not there anymore, wrote another book about Venona, and there are scholars. There's a small community. Paul Kingor would know all these people. He knew Herb very well. And these are people who are specialists. It's a small community. There are maybe 10 people that do this kind of stuff. And they know what they're doing. I have confidence in them, but even with them, I try to go behind what they write to get to document myself. But it's very tough for everybody. One thing I'm working on here is I'm writing about the immigration bill. This is a column I'm filing tomorrow. And they say, well, the immigration bill is this. Well, if you were writing about the immigration bill, what would you do? Maybe get to the bill and read the bill? Would that be a good thing to do? I think so. So it's what I did. Well, it's about 1,000 pages. So it's actually less. It's not actually 1,000. It's like 850 pages. That's all. And many people who comment on the bill have not read it. Well, I think that is very bad. And you cannot even, there are different secondary sources on that. And I look at them, but if I say, well, they say this, where is it in the bill? Let me look in the bill and see. I think that's what you got to do. But that's a long trail. Yes. Who are you pointing? This young lady here? Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Did I bypass somebody?
I'll come back to you. Is that okay?
Well, thank you. And I also am studying history, and my professors have been great, and when I have questions, they point me towards primary sources, encourage me to come up with my own opinions on things. But when it comes to the subject of subversion within a government or during the time of war, it's really hard to know where to look within an archive or within primary sources. So what sort of hints do you have about that?
Well, it's very tough. Let me go back to this book again. One of the things I found, it's a layer cake of problems because even the original sources themselves are not complete. And let's go back to Yalta, if I may. You've got the book. If you look right across from where we were before, just a little background, on page 44. In the official compilation of Yalta papers, there is a discussion of a conference that was held just before Yalta on the island of Malta, Yalta. And it involved American diplomats, Edward Stettinius and Alger Hiss and others, with Anthony Eden, who was the foreign minister of England at that time under Churchill, and Sir Alexander Cadogan, who was a diplomat in the British Foreign Office. And they're meeting in the island of Malta, going over stuff to be discussed with the Russians at Yalta. And in the State Department Yalta compilation, on the bottom of page 43, they discuss this, and the issue then was the issue of unity between the communists and the nationalists in China, which became a huge issue at Yalta and afterwards. They tried to push the communists into the government there. And the official Yalta compilation says, as you can see at the bottom of page 43, the issue of Chinese unity, quote, was raised, which is a big no-no, by the way, in any kind of journalism or history because you don't know who's doing something. It's called the passive voice. It was raised. Well, who raised it? Well, you can't find out from the official papers. But you turn to page 44 and you can find out. This is the graphic there is from the papers at UVA. And you look in the middle of the page, it says China. These are the papers I copied down there. At this point, Mr. Hiss brought up the question of China, which is not in the official Yalta compilation. So even that is not a primary source, but this is the primary source. And I didn't set out to find, I just happened across it doing my research. And what I tried to do in this book, and even more so in the McCarthy book, because there's so many controversies, is to do this, to reproduce photographically the original documents. Publishers hate this because it's so much work for them. And they want to put all the graphics in one part of the book all together. I said, no, it's got to be in the text next to the part where we're talking about what's going on. And this kind of thing happens a lot in official documents. And I regret to say I've seen a lot of it. Malcolm and I ran into this many times back in the old National Journalism Center days, where documents have been, in the FBI case, they're called redacted. You can get documents from the FBI, page after page after page is blacked out. That's called redacted. Now, this stuff is 50 years old. Why is it censored now. It's 60 years, 70 years old. And in the archives, same kind of problems. Documents, I encountered documents that disappeared from the archives. I'll give you one example. It disappeared from 2 different places in the archives, and this was a report that was published in 1946, a report from the State Department by a man named Samuel Klaus, K-L-A-U-S, who was a security officer in the U.S. State Department at that time. And he wrote a 106-page report about security in the State Department, in which he said there were a whole bunch of Soviet agents. He said there were 20 identified agents in the State Department at one time, 20. There were 13 identified members of the Communist Party, 70-some sympathizers. I mean, it was a humongous bunch of people. Doesn't mean he knew that, but that's what he was reported to the security people. So this document became a matter of controversy in the McCarthy debates. So I said, well, I want to see this document. So I go to, there was a committee called the Tidings Committee, which was the committee hearing these charges. Tidings was a senator from Maryland. And I go to the archives. The main archives are right down the hill here at 7th and Penn. Do you guys know where the museum is? Have you ever been by there? It's right diagonally across the museum. That's the National Archives. And there they have the files of all these committees from long ago. So I pull the files of this committee, and they're boxes and boxes and boxes. This report should be there. There is a letter of transmittal from the State Department to this committee saying, here is the report you requested. The report is gone. It's not there. So then I said, well, the guy Klaus was a State Department official. His papers are in another branch of the archives, which are in College Park, next door to the University of Maryland. And so I go out there and I pull his papers. And there in the index, papers of Samuel Klaus, anybody can get them, is listed this report by its title. I knew what the title was. So I go to his file and the box of stuff and go to the entry, and it's gone from there. And there is there a withdrawal notice. This is a report, mind you, written in 1946, a withdrawal notice that was issued in 1993, almost 50 years later. Somebody pulled this report out of the file there. So it's missing from 2 different places in the National Archives. This is in the intro. This is all in the intro of my McCarthy book. It's all there. And therefore, it was gone. However, I found it. I found the report. By sheer happenstance, it was at the FBI. The FBI had a copy of it. And whoever it was that was going around and pulling these documents could not get the FBI copy. You don't just wander into the FBI and take stuff out. At least you didn't back then. I don't know what's going on now. So that is an example of what we deal with if you try to do this kind of research. A lot of stuff is missing, and it makes a better story, but it makes a lot of work. So now this young lady here.
Hi, I'm Manzanita. I go to GMU. This is kind of a broad question.
You say JMU?
GMU.
George Mason.
Yeah.
Mason. You're
Yep,
Mason
Mason.
Nation. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I was sort of wondering.
Would you speak a little more loudly, please? I'm having a hard time. I wasn't kidding.
Yeah.
I'm
Sorry. There you go. I was wondering your take. Is that good?
Yeah, better.
I was wondering your take on just the differences between the McCarthy period and the present, as far as it seems like back then, most of the population was very anti-communist.
They were.
And so it was fairly, once you isolated who was a communist, you could remove them, and that sort of seems to have taken care of the problem, at least for a while, sort of purged them out.
Okay, well, the first part of your statement is correct. The second part, less so. The reason there was a disconnect there, the American population, I was part of it, I remember it, was very anti-communist, not only because just the nature of the country, but the Korean War was going on. The Korean War started in June of 1950. And so it wasn't just that there was some kind of concern about communists as such. They were killing Americans in Korea. So this tended to create a lot of anti-communism in this country, for obvious reasons. And that was very widespread sentiment. Joe McCarthy, who was active at this very time, he started in February 1950 and was going right through 54 when they finally censured him, was very popular. You would not know that to read many history books, but he was extremely popular for that reason. And in January 1954, there was a Gallup poll, I refer to this in my McCarthy book, which showed that 50% of the American people approved of Joe McCarthy, and only 35% disapproved. You would never know that from the way he is treated in the history books. It is hard to find a history book that has anything good to say about Joe McCarthy, quite the opposite. And that is based on the fact that the narrative that's out there, and it remains there, it has not changed, and despite all this new information, is that he was smearing innocent people, that he accused people of being communists without any proof, that he was just a demagogue, and so forth. And do you all know who Ann Coulter is? Do you know Ann?
Yeah.
Ann's another product of the NJC. She came out of the journalism center. And she wrote a book 10 years ago called Treason. And I said, if I wrote a book called Treason, I'd be hanging from a lamppost. But anyway, Ann can get away with it. And she had a chapter in it about McCarthy. And I worked with her on it, and she had sent it to me. And I helped her, gave her some information, and it's accurate. And I said, Ann, if you're going to write a chapter defending Joe McCarthy, you better be prepared to be attacked. They're going to say, well, he was evil, and he smeared innocent people, and so forth. And so I said, when that happens, and it will happen, and it did happen, they say, what about all these innocent people McCarthy smeared? What you need to say is, name one. And, of course, they never can. First of all, almost nobody knows anything about it, but what's out there is not true. And so she was on Bill O'Reilly's show. I saw this. And O'Reilly got into this thing about he smeared all these innocent people and said, name one to O'Reilly. And he didn't know what to say. And so he finally said, and this is more in the weeds, he said, Dalton Trumbo. Now, Dalton Trumbo, no reason you would have any idea who that was a Hollywood screenwriter in the 1940s who was a Soviet Stalinist sympathizer, hardcore communist. So he wasn't innocent, and he also wasn't a McCarthy case. He was a House Committee on Un-American Activities case. McCarthy had nothing to do with him. That's fairly typical. So that you're dealing with a vacuum, a real vacuum of information here, or worse, disinformation. Stuff you can go book after book after book, and I did it, and I deal with a lot of these people in my book. There's a book by a man named Thomas Reeves, and another by a man named David Oshinsky, and others. Those are the two main ones, two alleged biographies of McCarthy. And they got this stuff totally wrong. And one reason they didn't do Reeves did some pretty good research about McCarthy's childhood, that kind of thing. But in terms of the cases, he's got it all wrong. And I call him out on it. And I remember once Reeves had written, I'd had some correspondence with him, and in a way he was cooperative with me. I said I was looking at some of his citations, and I wanted to follow up on them. This is an example of using primary. His papers, interviews, are at Madison, Wisconsin, the Wisconsin State Historical Society. And he referred me there, and I got them, the papers I was interested in, many of them, and they were helpful, interviews he did, and so on. So I tried to backtrack on his citations. But when the book came, actually an article before the book came out, I sent him a copy of my article where I disagreed with him. This was an article in Human Events, a long 8 or 10 page article. And I said to him, I appreciated his courtesy, and it was a very awkward letter for me to write, but I disagree with him, and here it is. And if you have any response, please let us have it. Human Events will be glad to run it. I never heard another word from him. I never heard from him from that day forward. And that's true of all these people. And what happened was, Reeves is an example, and he's actually one of the least bad of the people doing it. I think he's an honest man. But what he did was to take stuff from the Tidings Committee report, which is wrong. It's just wrong, and it was a cover-up. And by the way, some parallels to what's going on now. Look at this Benghazi thing. I mean, that is just absolutely a carbon copy of what happened back then. Cover-up, deny, stonewall, the Susan Rice episode. Do you know about that? Do you know who she is? Who's now the new National Security Advisor in the White House. She went on 5 television shows in the wake of the Benghazi killing of our ambassador and 3 other Americans, and said it was all because of a video, and she said it over and over and over again, all totally false. Well, that is pretty much the kind of thing happened back then with these communist charges, and again, you see the parallels almost anywhere you look. So that I could go on about it, but enough of that. Over here.
Slide here.
Jack Butler from Hillsdale College. I'm currently reading Whittaker Chambers' book Witness.
Yes, very good.
And I think one of the great things about it is that it really crystallizes the appeal of communism as basically, he calls it man's second oldest faith.
Correct.
And a few years ago, I read Claire Berlinski's book about Margaret Thatcher, and she closes with the thesis that communism may have died in one form when the Berlin Wall fell and all that, but she thinks that it'll come back. And since she's made that since I read her observation on that, I've seen a lot of things to make me agree with her. Like I see the historical literacy that you talked about among people my age. The fact.
By the way, it's not just your age; it's my age too. Right?
That too.
Right.
The fact that almost everybody in this room was born, has no conscious memory of the existence of the Soviet Union.
Correct.
The fact that there's been polls that showed that plurality of people my age, like 18 to 30-year-old, prefer socialism to capitalism. Just things like that make me think, and maybe I'm just a cold warrior at heart, an old soul, but things like that make me think that communism is not quite dead, that it'll come back. And the other thing that, the other evidence I see is that with Margaret Thatcher's death, the last of the original generation to oppose communism, they're all gone. John Paul, Ronald Reagan, now Thatcher. I think that communism will come back in some form. And so, what do you think we can do either to stop it or to have it do as little damage as possible when it does return?
Well, first of all, it's never totally gone away. I mean, China. China was the biggest coup of all in Yalta. That's where Stalin got control of China, or got control of Manchuria, which is control of China. It's communist to this day. The undermining of Chiang Kai-shek, that's in this book, was done by Soviet agents in our government and elsewhere. Vietnam, Cuba, North Korea. There are communist states out there right now. I'm sorry?
Zimbabwe.
And Zimbabwe is exactly right. Zimbabwe, even though it's not nominally such, Mugabe is a Marxist, and the list is not long, but it's formidable. And you take a look at what happened in places like Venezuela, Chavez, it's Marxist. It's the same thing. So, yeah, it has never totally gone away, and in fact, there are signs of it creeping back here in our country. And I won't go into all of that, but you're right about that. And I think that the answer to that is got to be, you guys have got to tell me. I mean, it's up to you. I'm not going to be here. I'm not going to be here another 20 years. You are, and it's going to be the world you're living in. And I think we need to have a lot more young folks like you who are concerned about these matters and learning about them and willing to do the work. It's a lot of work. Did you say your name is Fowler?
No, Jack Butler.
Butler, okay. You must work with John Miller.
Yes, I know him very well.
Yeah, good. like this young man with Paul Kingor and you and John, those are two good people. You're very fortunate to have them as mentors. And I hope you're going to continue that. But we need a lot more like you. And Kingor is someone, and Miller too, that are encouraging. They're both encouraging to me because by my standards, they're young people. And we need that. You're right. The generation, I was sort of the part of that generation you're talking about, except I'm younger than the people you referred to. But yeah, my co-author is deceased. So we need you. Now let me say something about Margaret Thatcher and the world we live in. Everybody here know who Cher is? You know Cher? Are you familiar with her work? Do you know about the Twitter? Do you know? You know it?
I do know.
The Twitter?
Yes.
The tweet? Does everybody know what he's referring to? No. No. What it was that somebody tweeted, "Now Thatcher is dead," and a certain demographic has caused great consternation because they read it to mean, "Now that Cher is dead," which is not a joke. It actually happened. So the Twitter sphere is not a precise method of communicating, as if I know anything about it. But that generation, that story is yet to be fully understood of what it has been told, but not enough of what Reagan and Thatcher and the Pope did to bring down that evil empire. It was truly historic. And I think back to when I was your age, it was a long time ago, I did not think I would live to see the fall of the Soviet Union. The whole trend in my adult life, going back to 1950s, was the other way. One country after another that was being taken over by the communists, and our inability to do anything about it, or unwillingness in some cases. And Zimbabwe is a good example. That Zimbabwe was taken over in 1980 by a Marxist named Robert Mugabe, and he's there to this day, 30 years later. So Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul turned that around, and they knew what to do. And there's some reference to that in this book, not much because it's not that kind of book, but that story is worth telling in a lot more detail than is generally known. Now, how are we doing on?
Well, here's where we are. That brings us to the close of our regular program. Mr. Evans will be here to autograph your books. And we are also coming back here, this very room, July 17th, featuring a terrific author, another protege of Mr. Evans, Diana West, who's got a terrific book entitled, I want to get this title right, American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. There's a review of it sitting right here at your tables. And that'll be here from 6 to 8. You can actually RSVP for that on your way out tonight.
We'll just have that sitting up in the front corner, so if any of you are interested, you can just fill out this form. And we'll make sure to get you an email with some information about the next event.
Also want to say this evening is brought to you, as all our Conservative University Authors Nights are, by a generous grant from the Frank A. and Nellie Goletti Fusco Foundation, for which we are most appreciative. And we are most appreciative to have Mr. Evans with us tonight. Thank you all, and thank you.
Thank you.